I think all of you had a good Shankranti. So I think we'll begin with the class.
Okay, sir.
Yeah. So I'll just turn off the video because of the connectivity. Okay. So in the last class, we were discussing about some of the historical significance and the importance of plant diseases. And also we discussed about one of the toxins or the pathogens which are affecting the humans and animals after consumption. That was which we call it as the Saint Anthony's fire, which is also known as an ergotism. Okay. Ergotism is basically a kind of a syndrome which is caused due to the consumption of the infected grains of the ergot producing fungi. Ergot producing fungi, and that particular phenomenon is called as a ergotism, which is because of a fungus that is called as Claviceps purpureae. Okay, this is a fungus which often infects the grains of sorghum and bajra and many other crops. So this is a fungus which infects the grains, and if the grains are consumed, it is known to cause the ergotism, which is toxinogenic in nature for the humans and animals. So this ergot is consisting of an alkaloid, and this alkaloid is nothing but the LSD. The LSD, it is a lysergic acid diethylamide. That is the lysergic acid diethylamide, which is often used by many of the people for mainly for hallucinogenic effect or for hallucination. This is like your common drugs or whatever the drugs people take, and which was becoming more and more popular in Bangalore and Karnataka, where this is a potent compound which can be also derived from the ergot or the ergot fungus. Ergotism is an example for a mycotoxicosis. Ergotism is an example of mycotoxicosis. What is a mycotoxicosis? Mycotoxicosis is a toxic effect due to the fungus. When the fungus infected plant parts are consumed, it is known to cause the mycotoxicosis. And also, this the consumption of the infected or the diseased grains or the plant parts is also has led to an outbreak of gangrene. The gangrene, which is again because of the ergotism, which had occurred in Ethiopia in 1978. That is, in Ethiopia, because of the consumption of the ergot infected grains, has led to an outbreak of the gangrene, which is, what is a gangrene means. And there was a disease in basically the birds in England that was called as a turkey X disease. Many of the farm animals, mainly the birds, which were fed with these infected grains or the grains which are infected, mainly with the aflatoxin, many of the birds got a disease called as a turkey X disease because of the consumption of your the contaminated by the aflatoxins. And you know that this aflatoxin can be seen in or it appears in the milk of the animals. And because of which, when we consume those milk, this can lead to or attack the liver, causing the liver failure. And apart from that, these are also the mutagenic agents, or they act as to cause the mutation. They also cause tetragenic effect and also the carcinogenic effect. So all these mutagenic, tetragenic, and carcinogenic, these are due to the aflatoxin, which is produced by Aspergillus or Aspergillus flavus. So ultimately, what we are trying to understand is the plant diseases not only affect the quality and quantity, they also affect the produce. As such, when it is consumed, they are affecting the human beings. Another example is in case of the fusarium toxin. The fusarium is one other fungus which is known to cause a plant disease, which is also having a capability to produce the toxins. Especially this fusaric or the fusarium toxin, it affects the horses. It affects the horses because of a disease called as fuminosis. A disease called as a fuminosis. What is a fuminosis? Is nothing but the liquefaction of the brain, or it liquefies the brain, or it makes the brain to produce a lot of liquids, because of which there is a disease, because of which the horses lose the blindness, that is called as the blind staggers. That is called as a blind staggers. It is also called as a crazy horse disease. A crazy horse disease. This is a very common thing when an animal, or basically a horse, is fed with an infected fusarium toxin that is known to cause the fuminosis, which is known to cause the liquefaction or liquefies the brain, leading to the blind staggers, or it is also called as a crazy horse disease. And another fungal pathogen, again infecting the grains and straw, which is called as the Stachybotrys. The Stachybotrys chartorum. This Stachybotrys chartorum often grows on a straw and a feed that is normally consumed by many of the animals. And when it is consumed, when the Stachybotrys chartorum infected straw and a feed is consumed, this is known to cause a syndrome that is called as a sick building syndrome. Sick building syndrome, which is a very common disease or a syndrome which is commonly seen in many of the animals when it is fed with these type of infect grains or a straw. So these are all some of the importance of plant diseases. But when we look into the historical part, there were many books in plant pathology, and some of the books which were written by a Greek philosopher, and whose name was called as Theophrastus. Theophrastus, who recorded at the time, it was around 2,400 years back itself, he recorded many of the observations on the plant diseases. Just imagine 2,400 years ago, Theophrastus, who was a Greek philosopher, he did mention about the many of the diseases which are caused by plants, and he made an observation. I mean, he did not study it, but he made an observation. And you know, our Indian civilization is also very unique and quite old. In India, you know that the agriculture started somewhere between 4,000 years old. It is not a new one. And even there was a mention of plant diseases in many of the cases in India, well before Theophrastus recorded all this. And if you consider where were these in Indian context 4,000 years back, in Rig Veda, which was between 1500 to 500 BC, and also in Arthashastra of Kautilya, which was between 321 to 186 BC, you know, the Kautilya's kingdom, the Chandragupta's, and also in Sushrit Samhita, which was between 200 to 700 AD, and Vishnu Dharmatra, which was between 500 to 700 AD. So these are all the ancient books from India where the plant diseases are, they were calling it as the enemies of the plants, have been mentioned. Indicating what? Indicating that the people who are aware of the plant diseases 4,000 years back in the Indian context, and if you look into the global, it was 2,400 years back, where Theophrastus was the first to mention about the plant diseases in several books. If you take the Rig Veda as such, in Rig Veda, there was a classification of the plant diseases was given, and also the germ theory. The germ theory of the plant diseases was advocated. So, but when we talk about the germ theory and spontaneous generation theory, it was in somewhere between 1800s, because where the evidence was given. But in those times, they were just mentioning that there were some germs or the enemies that were causing a disease. There was one classical book which was worth to mention, that is called as Vriksha Ayurveda. This is a book which was written by Surupal, which was the first book exclusively devoted for the plant diseases. Exclusively means in specific. Vriksha. Vriksha is a plant. Ayurveda is an ailment or a knowledge of medicine. So people at the time in Vriksha Ayurveda, which was written by Surupala, which was a classical book about the plant diseases, which is an age-old book, I can say. And apart from that, even in the Bible, and also in the Shakespeare poems, you know, the Shakespeare was one of the well-known writer and a poetist. And so several of the Christian literature mentioned about the plant diseases. Apart from that, the Jataka of Buddhism and Raghuvansh of Kalidasa had also mentioned about some of the plant diseases. So as I was mentioning about the Theophrastus, who was there in 370 to 286 BC, he wrote a book called as a Inquiry into Plants. Inquiry into Plants. And he recorded in this book, Inquiry into Plant, he recorded all the experiences about the plant diseases. That is, whatever he was feeling at the time, looking into the plants, what were the diseases, he mentioned about the diseases based on his experience and sometimes the imagination and the observations. And remember, this was not based on the experimentation or the science. This was based on the imagination, observation, and the experience. After the time of Theophrastus, just imagine, for next 2000 years, no definite opinion could be formed about the plant disease. Means no one were thinking about it. And the pathogens continued to cause the diseases. And many of the time, you know that even today, some places it happens like that. The diseases were attributed to many causes like the divine powers. Means they were thinking that the diseases might be due to some divine power or some religious beliefs or the superstitions or the effect of stars and moons. Some people thought it is the bad wind. Some people thought it is the wrath of God. The wrath of God. And why I am talking about this particular point is, during the Roman times, a special god called as Rubigo, a special god, because the Romans used to worship the stars and moons. Rubigo was worshipped by the Romans mainly to protect their grains, mainly the wheat grains, mainly from the wheat grains, and where they used to sacrifice the red dog, so that their grains are not affected. So this sacrification of a dog for the god called as Rubigo, and the festival was called as a Rubigalia. The festival was called as a Rubigalia. This is an evidence to show that people were aware of the diseases and they used to think that the diseases were because of the divine powers or the superstitions and many other things, or a bad wind or a wrath of a god, and so on and so on. This is an historical part of how the diseases were perceived by many of the Indian as well as the ancient histories. So when did the phenomenon of plant pathology or plant disease came into existence? So if you see the evolution or the development of microbiology and plant pathology were found to be very synonymous. So this came with several contributions. That is, people started to study. When was the first study that was initiated? As you all know, being completed your microbiology course in 1675, Anton van Leeuwenhoek, who was a Dutch worker, and he was the first person to observe the microscopes because he was the one who developed a first simple microscope, under which he observed several of the spores as well as the bacteria, how are the shapes. And in 1729, these contributions are very, very important. It is not to give a a complete this thing, because these are all very important, because of which the development of a plant pathology or a plant disease came into existence. In 1729, an Italian botanist who was called as P.A. Michelli, he was the first to discover, or he discovered, the fungus originates from the spores. He was the first to discover the fungus originates from the spores. That is, the spores are the ones which are giving rise to the fungus. Hence, he was called as a father of mycology. Mycology is the study of fungus, so he was called as the father of mycology. In 1755, another French botanist, he was called as Tillet, a French botanist, where he published a paper on a disease called as bunt and stinking smut. A stinking smut of wheat, and discovered a disease called a disease called as a bunt disease. Means the first people who started to give the names for various diseases. So after that, after 1755 to 1837, there was C.H. Persoon. He was the first person to write a book in the modern sciences. He wrote a book on classification of fungi that was called as Synopsis Methodica Fungarum. So that is called as a Synopsis Methodica Fungarum. And this is the first book about a classification based on the scientific evidence. In 1807, a French scientist again, who was called as Prevost, and Prevost was the first person to show that the bunt disease of wheat is a fungus. Whereas Tillet, he mentioned about a disease, but Prevost showed that the bunt of wheat is a fungus and showed that the fungus is a microorganism. At the time, people were just still studying about some of the microbes and other things. 1821, scientist named Fries, he published a book called as Systema Mycologicum. Systema Mycologicum, naming of the fungus. That means the Systema Mycologicum is a naming of the fungus. And he is the one who is named as the Linnaeus of mycology. That is, you know that Linnaeus is the one who has described many of the organisms. Even today, all of the organisms which have been named are because of the Linnaeus. So in case of the fungal naming, Fries is considered to be as the Linnaeus of mycology. And again in the same year, 1821, Robertson, who was from England, he stated that the sulfur is found to be an effective effective against mildews, mainly in peaches, in peach. So he mentioned about the use of sulfur, or he stated that sulfur can be used against the mildew of peaches. And as you all know, in 1845, there was an Irish famine, which we discussed in the last class about what is the importance and how this disease has led to and hunger, social changes, and so on. In 1858, Kuhn, he published a first book on in-plant pathology that was called as the diseases of cultivated crops, their causes, and their control. So this is a first book talking about only plant diseases and what are the causes and their control or the management. So until now, we were not very clear about what are the causal agents and what are the type of diseases. So as I mentioned in my previous class, in 1861, Anton de Barry, who was basically from Germany, he worked on the life cycle of the potato late blight. The potato late blight, and proved experimentally that the Phytophthora infestans is the causal agent. This is the first evidence. Please make a note. This is the first evidence of someone mentioning about a plant disease. Experimentally proved that the causal agent, that is the micropathogenic organisms, are causing a disease. And he also discovered the heterogeneous. He also discovered the heterogeneous nature of the rust fungi in wheat. The rust fungi of wheat. This was done in 1865. 1865, he discovered the heterogeneous nature of the rust fungi. This is again. So because of this, two important significant contributions. One is experimentally proving that late blight is caused by Phytophthora infestans, which is a Oomacetes fungi, and the heterogeneous nature of the rust fungi. He is regarded as a father of modern plant pathology. So, who is the father of modern plant pathology? It is the Anton de Barry. And in 1869, again, we discussed about it, about the Ceylon rust, where England loses coffee, or you should remember about the 11 o'clock coffee, and the economic and social impact that was a very serious thing that was considered at that point of time. And later, in another important event that happened is in 1885 by Millard. And he discovered a wonderful chemical that is called as borax mixture. Borax mixture. Which is even today, you see that in 1885, more than 120 years, still this chemical is used for many diseases, including the fungal diseases and the bacterial diseases. This discovery was substantial, I can say. So what happened is, just to take up with a small story here, he was a French chemist. He was working in a University of Bordeaux, and he was at that particular point of time, the downy mildew was one of the serious problems in all parts of the grape growing, that is called as a grape downy mildew, was a serious problem because in France they imported some resistant stocks of the grape wine, where that clones were found to be more susceptible for the grape downy mildew. The disease became very serious, and the grape wine industry, in France and other countries, the grape is one of a common grape, wine, the cheese, bread. These are the three major components of their diet. So when this happened in France and Bordeaux in specific, Millardet, he was walking in the evening across the countryside, and he could see that some of the grape plants were showing something like a bluish color on the leaves. And accidentally, he saw that there was no disease on those leaves, but that is especially on the border leaves. So the border ones, the border crops, these were not having any kind of the disease except for the blue color indication. He asked that farmer, what is that happened to this? What did you spray? He just told, I sprayed copper just to avoid the trespassers so that they pick the grapes. So he just used that to protect his, like it's just like a fencing. So then he thought, okay, what happened to this? So he went back to the laboratory and used copper sulfate plus lime. Copper sulfate plus lime. So this he used in various combinations. He worked out in the lab and finally came out with 1% of the preparation by adding copper sulfate and lime in different proportions. And ultimately it was found that this copper sulfate and the lime are very effective. That is what he called it as a Bordeaux mixture. Bordeaux is the name of a place in France, and a mixture. He mixed various combinations. So this is again a wonderful story about how a discovery of a fungicide, a first fungicide, which was called as a Bordeaux mixture, even after 120 years, still that chemical is very, very effective. Okay. This is about the Millardet's discovery. And after that, in 1874, it was Robert Hartig. He published a book which entitled as The Important Diseases of Forest Trees. Important diseases of forest trees. And in 1878 again, Oberfield. And here and all, you will see that how the science of plant pathology has developed over the period of time. And he was a colleague of de Bary, and he was the person who developed artificial cultivation of microorganisms. Remember, artificial, that is the preparation of the culture media, was started with mainly for the pathogens or microorganisms. And he also illustrated the complete life cycle of cereal smut fungi. Cereal smut fungi. Okay. So in 1877, Voronin, he discovered a disease called as clubroot of cabbage. The clubroot of cabbage, which was caused by a pathogen that is called as a Plasmodiophora brassicae. Plasmodiophora brassicae. This is the one which is known to cause a clubroot disease in case of cabbage. And Voronin also found a life cycle of a disease called as a wart of potato. That means he found out the life cycle of a wart disease of potato. And in 1878, the downy mildew disease was introduced. And I already mentioned in France, because of which entire industry was lost because of one. Even today, this disease is a very serious problem in many of the cucurbit crops, and very specifically in case of grapes. So in 1881, Marshall Ward, so he was the one who worked on the life cycle of coffee rust. The life cycle of coffee rust, you can imagine after 20 years, it took for Marshall Ward to work on the life cycle of coffee rust. Hence, and he also exclusively worked on forest diseases. He was called as father of forest pathology. He was called as a father of forest pathology. And later, in 1885, A.B. Frank, he was the one who defined and named so-called as the mycorrhizal association, especially to the roots. He first showed about the association of mycorrhizae with the plant roots. Okay. And in 1887, Masson from France, he introduced another type of a fungicide which is called as a Burgundy mixture. It's called as a Burgundy mixture. And this is a substitute for your borax mixture. Okay. In 1894, Erickson. So this is again a very significant contribution. Please make a note out of this. A Swedish scientist, he described the phenomenon of so-called as the physiological races. The physiological races means the physiological races of a cereal rust. The cereal rust, which is caused by Puccinia graminis. Puccinia graminis triticide. Puccinia graminis triticide. This is again a very important with respect to the pathogens, mainly the plant diseases, physiological races. We will define this, what is the physiological races later. Okay. In 1904, Blacksley, who was an American genetist. So this is, you can see how the genetics and plant pathology came together. He first founded so-called as a heterothallism in a fungus called as a rhizopus. So you can see that how the genetics also started with the plant pathology. Means there are several organisms that have been used to study the genetics. Okay. In the same year, 1904, Bison, he first showed that the resistance to the pathogens in the plant is inherited by the Mendelian character. That means he showed that the resistance to the plant can be inherited as a Mendelian character. That is whatever the Mendelian behavioral changes that happens over the crossing and other things that can also be seen in the plants for the resistance to the pathogens mainly. In 1906, Carley, he discovered the use of the lime sulfur. Mainly to control a disease in apple that is called as a scab of apple. The scab of apple. And in the same year, L.R. Jones, he was the first person to study so-called as a pectolytic enzymes. So these pectolytic enzymes are the ones which are causing a disease called as a soft rot. So whenever you go to a market, you'll see some of the vegetable or a fruit is soft. That is because of a disease called as a soft rot, which is due to the pectolytic enzymes. 1912, Burgess, where he defined the phenomenon of a process called as a heterokaryosis. What is heterokaryosis? Basically, the heterokaryosis is a fusion between dissimilar nuclei. A dissimilar nuclei within the fungal cell. Heterokaryosis is a fusion between the dissimilar nuclei within the fungal cell. One very significant contribution from E.C. Stackman, and he demonstrated the presence of physiological forms. Physiological forms in stem rest of wheat. Physiological forms. That is the presence of different forms within the pathogen. This is what we call the subspecies, something like races or mutants. You can imagine like what the coronavirus mutant is having. So this stem rest do have different forms. 1918, E.J. Butler, he was exclusively working on Indian fungi, and he made an exhaustive study in Indian plant diseases. And he published a book called as Fungi and Diseases in Plant. Fungi and Diseases in Plant. And he is also called as the father of modern plant pathology in India. Please make a note out of it. The father of modern plant pathology in India. Please make a note. In India. Okay, Butler means in India. Anthony de Bary, he is the father of modern plant pathology for the entire globe. And E.J. Butler was the first director of the Imperial Bureau of Mycology, and which is also called as a CMI, which is a Commonwealth Mycological Institute. And now it is called as a CABI. International Mycological Institute, and which is present in Kew, England. Okay. This was, so he is called as a father of modern plant pathology, in particular India. 1927, Craigie, he defined the function of pycnia in a rust fungi. So what is pycnia? I will tell you, it is one of the structure of the fungi. So just you can remember that Craigie was the first person to define the function of the pycnias. 1927 again, Shear and Dodge. So this was the first time where they discovered a red bread mold, which is so called as neurospora. And the significance of this neurospora is that it is an ideal organism to study law, or we can say that the law of heredity, which is an ideal organism, which is a very model organism, like your Drosophila melanogaster or the Xenorhabditis elegans nematode. So earlier they used to use the Neurospora crassa and fungus causing the red bread mold to study the law of heredity. And of course, in 1929, Sir Alexander Fleming, he isolated an antibiotic, you know very well, that is from Penicillium notatum. So the penicillin was isolated from an organism that is called as a Penicillium notatum. And this is a wonderful drug, I can say, which was discovered in 1929. And this has led to a lot of significance with respect to human health also. In 1931, J.C. Luthra, so he was the person who developed a solar heat treatment method mainly to control the seed-borne loose mut of wheat. And in 1932, Hansen and Smith, who first demonstrated the origin of physiological races through a process called as a heterokaryosis. So that means to say he first time showed that the physiological races emerge through a process called as a heterokaryosis. 1934, Tisdale and Williams They first studied about an organic fungicide and discovering an organic fungicide called as alkyl dithiocarbamate. Alkyl dithiocarbamate. So this was the first discovery of an organic-based fungicide. 1938, again, H.N. Hansen, he showed the dual phenomenon of the fungi imperfecti. That is, many of the plant pathogens exist both in different stages, even in the sexual and asexual stage. That is one different lot of things that normally you can see. Both sexual and asexual stage do exist in many of the plant pathogens. And one of the greatest contribution, even today we are working with this, is the H.H. Flor, who developed an hypothesis called as gene-to-gene hypothesis. So H.H. Flor means, you should remember that he is the one who developed a hypothesis called as a gene-to-gene hypothesis while working with the disease called as a flax rust, which is caused by Melamsora linii. Melamsora linii, which is again a rust disease, but is causing disease on the flax. Okay. And as you all know, in 1943, 2 and 3, there was a Bengal famine. Some of the years you should remember, like Irish famine, Ceylon rust, and Bengal famine. But for others, you can remember the contributions, which is very, very important, rather than remembering the years. In 43, Diamond Harburger and Horsfall, they discovered another fungicide, another dithiocarbamate, that is called as the ethylene bis dithiocarbamates. Ethylene bis dithiocarbamate, which is also presently being used. 1945, Horsfall, he explored the mechanism of fungicidal action, how the fungicide works, or how fungicide act on a fungus. And he published a book called as Principles of Fungicidal Action. Principles of a fungicidal action. 1948, B.V. Mundukor, he was the person who started a famous society in plant pathology that is called as Indian Society of Indian Phytopathological Society. Sorry, it is called as a Indian Phytopathological Society, and a journal called as Indian Phytopathology. Okay. The journal called as a Indian Phytopathology, and he wrote a book called as Fungi and Plant Diseases. Fungi and Plant Diseases. And also a second book which was written by him was called as a Plant Pathology in India. A Plant Pathology in India. 1951, E.A. Gorman. He is regarded as the person who first investigated the physiology of the wilt. The physiology of the wilt caused by fusarium. And he put forth the involvement of a toxin in causing disease. And the theory, whenever you talk about a Gorman, it is the toxin theory. He was the first person to show that the toxins are causing the plant diseases. Okay. Earlier, we used to in the first beginning we discussed about the toxins causing illness in the humans and animals. But here the government proposed the theory of the toxin causing plant diseases, like wilts is one of the examples. And 1952. Jensen, he proposed multi-lines, mainly to reduce the rust disease of oats. Multi-lines is each line having different resistant genes. That is why it's called multi-lines. But agronomically, they are similar. But each line differs with respect to the resistance. And the greatest contribution, Norman E. Burlong. You know very well that he developed the multi-line cultivars, again, multi-line cultivars in wheat, and developed several of the resistant wheat cultivars, which led to the broader adaptation. And he prevented the hunger, famine, because of the introduction of several resistant varieties. He was awarded the Nobel Prize. Nobel Prize for peace, mainly, not for in-plant pathology. So, because of his contribution for developing the high-yielding resistant varieties, and he is the only plant pathologist who has received, I repeat, the plant pathologist. Otherwise, who have worked with several organisms for different purpose, yes, but as a plant pathologist, he is the one who has received the Nobel Prize for his contribution in the field of development of multi-line cultivars in wheat with the disease resistance, broader adaptation, which had led to prevention of the hunger. Okay, so we will stop here at the moment, and we will continue in the next class. So, any questions for this? Any questions? If no questions, I think we'll stop here, and we will continue in the next class. We'll talk, because these contributions are important, because these are also important with respect to your examinations. So hence, though it is something like a monotonous, but it is inevitable to understand or know about it in particular. Okay. So with this, we'll stop here and continue in the next coming class.